get the expertise to ensure that with the units that you have are able to pivot quickly to the markets where the customers are. And it means that you need to have agility in the DNA of the company to really move very quickly from one market to the other, or increase capacity to where the business is and maybe forego some of the flying that you originally did. And obviously, if you have a small team, that puts tremendous pressure on that team. And so I think it is very important that there's a combined vision of the shareholder, that board members understand the economics and the operational challenges that an airline faces, so they have the right type of skills and experience in your supervisory board, so you can support the management board, which is under tremendous pressure to take these decisions and take them quickly. And obviously always ensuring that the board is looking at the longer term picture. The volatility of the industry will always be there. So you have to look at what's happening tomorrow, but also what is impacting business in 5 to 7 or 10 years' time. And so with everybody in the value chain, you have to have alignment between airline, tourism bureau, ministries, civil aviation, airports, and work on a vision and then implement it. And if you don't have the expertise in house, ensure that you get the necessary expertise from the market, because things are moving very quickly. Michael O'Leary said that he still feels very bullish about the future at 67 per barrel until March 2027. They're very well positioned to take any volatility in the market compared to a lot of the European peers. They're in much better shape. And since they have the lowest cost, when other airlines will be forced to increase their fares due to their higher fuel cost base, then Ryanair won't have to do that so much. So it's actually better for them. Ryanair is getting 27 or 28 MAX 10s in the upcoming year, which will have 20% more seats and 20% lower fuel burn. So their cost of operation will actually come down quite considerably, which make them more efficient. And so they grow their capacity to well over 300 million seats, and they expect to have 300 million boardings by 2034. So they're in excellent shape. Said that he believes that there's more consolidation expected because some of the airlines that are on life support and not part yet of a consolidated group will require additional funding from their shareholders. For instance, Air Baltic. Wizz Air is also uncertain what will happen with them. Wizz Air had a strategy that was based on flying longer sectors with a AOC setup in the Gulf, but now they've had to abandon that plan. And that means that they no longer are interested in taking their 321 XLRs, long-range aircraft, because their stage lengths will be shorter because of that.
And against that background, Remco, you're looking now at fuel prices that, based on analysis that we've done, may be sitting north of $100 a barrel. And that's if there's steady state and over the next 12 months. How are these airlines that are configured broadly for stable operations going to be dealing with what is geopolitically an extremely unstable operating environment? How does that work now? How are they going to cope as management and leadership teams?
Well, they will have to cut costs because, the fuel cost, they can't influence. It's an external cost, about 28% of their overall cost. And it means that they will likely look at their networks and axe routes that are unprofitable. So they have to look at their network map and say, hey, which of these routes are not sustainable at the current operating cost level. And they will shift capacity to routes where there's still demand and where part of the demand moves away from, let's say, the interstopping point in, for instance, the Gulf. So you see carriers like Singapore Airlines opening up more direct routes into Europe this summer, as are some other European airlines flying more into Asia and also into Africa, moving capacity there. Because, the demand is still very strong, and part of that capacity was provided by Gulf carriers through the main hubs in the Gulf, like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha. And even though they're restoring some of that connectivity, it's still well below what it was last summer. So you'll have a lot of scrutiny on network, and they will be very disciplined in seeing how they can take out capacity where it's really a loss-making operation.
We go back to previous conversation where we were talking principally about the whole concept of consolidation within the European environment and how that is affecting the viability of the smaller operators that haven't consolidated. Do you see that pressure now extending beyond Europe? Are you now looking at an environment where the cost of doing business as a small airline is now becoming so complex, so changeable, that small management teams are going to have to consolidate their operations and also their thinking in order to survive what is likely to be a long-term geopolitically unstable environment?
Within Europe, we know that SAS is moving into the Air France-KLM group, which will get a controlling share very soon. And then our Portugal is either going to Air France-KLM or the Lufthansa group. AFKL have already announced that they will change the name of their holding. So the brands will remain, but the name of the holding will get a separate name for it to include more partners. And then basically within Europe, all the majors have found place within one of the three. And then whoever is left, the smaller ones, which are Air Baltic and Finnair, and then to a lesser extent, maybe Tarom and LOT Polish, they have to find a place or basically be supported by their shareholder if they want to sustain it. But there's a lot of money going in. Norse is up for sale. So the Norse was a Norwegian leisure operator that operated flights out of Scandinavia and in Gatwick and also Berlin. They had a bit of flying, and then went on an ACMI adventure operating flights for Indigo, and they have now said that it's not sustainable. They're too small, and they want to sell that company. So they were one of the first private companies that said this is not a sustainable situation. And I expect some of the smaller state-owned airlines to follow suit within Europe. And some of them will definitely fall over because it's going to become harder and harder for them at these cost levels because they don't have the money to hedge the fuel going forward. Year on year, fuel, according to IATA, is about 78% increased. It fluctuates a bit week by week, but as we speak, it's 77% more than a year ago. And the fares won't be 77% more than a year ago. On some specific long-haul routes where there's a lot of demand because customers shy away from flying through the Gulf region, the fares have gone up on long-haul routes, but on short-haul, there's no way that the revenue will be able to cover these costs.
So if we look at the European environment here, you've got Ryanair now ordering airplanes that are 20% more efficient from a fuel burn perspective, can carry 20% more passengers. You've got the smaller operators, the smaller low-cost operators who don't have that pricing advantage, both in aircraft acquisition, the fleet modernization, and the fuel advantages that spin out of that. You have 260 to 360 million seats are going to be absorbed by the Ryanair group. It's a pretty dire situation if you're sitting as the leadership team of a small European airline to figure out what your future is going to be, particularly against such a volatile geopolitical environment, which is unlikely to be.
It is. I mean, so for the network carriers, of course, they still feed customers into their long-haul network operations, which are, of course, are the money makers for most of them. For the smaller ones that are purely focusing on regional traffic, it will be very hard to compete with Ryanair. It will be impossible for them to compete at the cost level. So unless they have a captive market with very high barriers to entry for competition, then if we know of Ryanair, they also want the overall cost of doing business to be lower. So they like airports with low fees and low taxes. And if the taxes go up, they pull out. And so there will be city pairs, of course, that they don't want to serve because they just shift their capacity to the markets, to the airports, the bases where their model works best, and which that is the lowest possible overall environment. But definitely smaller regional carriers, smaller the other low-cost carriers will have a lot of difficulty competing with that going forward.
And we must be looking at airline failures on quite a substantial scale, I would think, with you have the combined effect of a major competitor with a huge cost advantage, fuel hedged at $67 a barrel, rolling in with this next generation of equipment and expanding the market.
Yeah. What's interesting is that IAG decided, because they started purchasing MAX 8s and MAX 10s for Vueling, and they are extending or basically changing some of the options into more aircraft deliveries. Vueling has a lot of Airbuses right now, and it seems that IAG wants to have some leverages against the old Airbus fleet that they operate and start purchasing other Maxes right now. And it's kind of shifting. And you also see that in the deliveries, whereas Airbus was ahead and Boeing was very much plagued by certification issues. Now it seems that Airbus is slowing down, not so much because of Airbus, but also because of Pratt & Whitney engine delivery issues, but also overall in their supply chain. They can't deliver the number of aircraft that they've contracted. So that seems to be shifting a bit.
But it's an interesting decision for IAG, surely, that you're taking essentially a low fares operator like Vueling and taking one of the principal elements of low-cost operation is a homogenous fleet and ownership costs, and splitting it across two aircraft types with different training, different ground support equipment requirement, and everything. And then they're not as efficient as your principal competitor, Ryanair, who are going to be zipping around the skies in max 10s. How is that going to work?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's gonna. Transition's always difficult, and it seems it's very strange. You look at Air France, KLM with Transavia, and KLM is moving from 737s to Airbus, and some of the others are doing it the other way around. And I think it's just, for the larger groups like Air France, KLM with Transavia as a low-cost operator, and IAG with Vueling as their lower-cost operator. It's much more of a defensive move against Ryanair, so keeping them out of the market, well, with their low-cost product, even though the costs of those operators are much higher than Ryanair's will ever be. And of course, Ryanair has been with Boeing from the very beginning. They purchase these aircraft very smartly, anti-cyclically. So when the market's bad, they go in and, like O'Leary said, we purchased 300 at the midst of COVID. Got very good deals on them, but nobody else wanted to order aircraft, was giving them back. And so, clearly, there is an operational simplicity advantage that they have, whereas the others are basically in the process of transitioning in and out of fleet, which always costs a lot more because you have dual fleet lines in maintenance and camo, and also your training pipeline with pilots for both and cabin for both and ground equipment, what have you. So, and that takes, with the fleet numbers that we talk about, for Vueling and also for Transavia, France and the Netherlands, it takes about probably 6 to 7 years before that whole fleet is renewed. And so you carry those double costs for a long time, the complexity for a long time.
So we're looking at Europe and potentially particularly with the competitive environment, the geopolitical environment, a lot of competition, and potentially a lot of operators will be either swimming in red ink or going out of business. What about the second and third level operators outside of Europe, Oceania and elsewhere? Where do we see that?
Because they're even smaller, for them it's even more difficult. And I think in most cases, when it's an island operator and the connectivity is an absolute must, be it Capo Verde Airlines or Seychelles or Mauritius or some of the other island operators, Sri Lankan, that require connectivity, and they want some control over their destiny by having their own airline. But clearly the economics where they sit with the fuel levels that they have to pay make it very hard. And I think there it is more the sum of all parts of the aviation tourism ecosystem that is the most important piece. So when the visitors are still coming and they're spending money in country, that is the most important element of it, which means that the airline, which is the lowest margin entity in the total value chain, is allowed to not be profitable as long as the overall system makes money.
That was sounding to me like a fundamental change in business modeling, isn't it? That you go from the raw airline model to a homogenous economic model for the territory in which the airline's operating, with partner support from government and or the tourism industry itself to a greater extent probably than it is now. Because the key element,
with everything that happened in the Gulf region, these countries have also come to understand that when they're too reliant on Middle Eastern carriers for providing tourism, so providing basically capacity into their country, and it stops overnight, then immediately their tourism ecosystem is massively impacted. So for them, it is worthwhile looking into continuing to maintain their own airlines, or at least have some say in providing that capacity themselves, even though it will come at a cost. And obviously, there's always the requirement to do that as economically as possible. And try to find partnerships on the distribution side, work with other airlines, lower the costs, have increased fleet utilization, ensuring that they have the right fleet mix. But because their routes are limited, so the economies of scale that major carriers have, they don't have, and they will never have.
So how, if you're a board of a small airline now, the decisions you're taking right now in the face of probably one of the most geopolitical environments we've known for a very long time, with an unprecedented closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the choking off of the Gulf area, and the limitations on the Gulf carriers, how do you as a small team get in the necessary critical thinking to work through that process? What's the process? How can we support airlines in achieving that? What is it that we can bring to an operator that will enhance their decision making and accelerate it? Because it's not a time when you can sit back and allow this just to wash over you, because actually it'll be it's a tidal wave, isn't it, essentially?
Well, business needs to be managed on P&L in the end, and obviously when the P or the revenue is under pressure, you have to get the expertise to ensure that with the units that you have are able to pivot quickly to the markets where the customers are. And it means that you need to have agility in the DNA of the company to really move very quickly from one market to the other, or increase capacity to where the business is and maybe forego some of the flying that you originally did. And obviously, if you have a small team, that puts tremendous pressure on that team. And so I think it is very important that there's a vision, combined vision of the shareholder that trickles down to board members that understand the economics and the operational challenges that an airline faces. So they have the right type of skills and experience in your supervisory board, so you can support the management board, which is under tremendous pressure to take these decisions and take them quickly. And obviously always ensuring that the board is looking at the longer term picture. The volatility of the industry will always be there. So we basically have to look at what's happening tomorrow, but also what is impacting my business in, say, 5 to 7 or 10 years time. Because if you order an aircraft now, you won't have it for at least a couple of years, depending on the type that you want. And so, with everybody in the value chain, you have to have alignment between airline, tourism bureau, ministries, civil aviation, airports, and work on a vision and then implement it. And if you don't have the expertise in-house, ensure that you get the necessary expertise from the market, because things are moving very quickly, not only in technology, but also geopolitically, also, of course, in systems and AI and decision-making. And especially when people who live on a smaller, more remote, isolated place, it's quite hard to always keep up with whatever's happening in their periphery, particularly if they're fully focused on basically saving the operation day to day.
And it's often the case, is it not, that management boards have to manage up and actually communicate the operational consequences that they're facing from decisions taken at the supervisory board level, isn't it? So it's actually taking all elements of the operations so they're fully aligned with the nature of the problem and therefore able to take the decisions rapidly but effectively to deal with that, and looking also at the resiliency of the operation, and not just in the short term, because this is the biggest geopolitical situation we've seen so far in recent history, I think, would be fair to say, possibly from an airline point of view, up there with COVID, and possibly beyond, because there is the potential for further strangulation through Hormuz, but also all going forward in what is looking, to me at least, and to us, I'm sure, an increasingly more geopolitically complex and threat environment. Is that a fair analysis?
So the cost of doing business, the cost of operation will go up. It'll go up quicker than the ticket prices. So that means that your margins is on a tremendous pressure, because there is a specific segment that will continue to fly, and depending on the geography where you're in North America, on the mainline airlines, higher premium focus. So there's more customers that are willing to pay a lot more, and they don't really have the low cost like we have in Europe, because even some of the other low-cost carriers, Southwest is no longer really a low-cost carrier that also provides connecting traffic. And the fares are much higher than in what they are in Europe. But in other markets, if basically your cost per seat goes up quite considerably, and if you fly to overseas markets that's still developing, like India, for instance, or Indian subcontinent or parts of Africa. There is growth, and there's also growth of the middle class. But if your cost level goes up, then of course your price level has to come up as well, at least temporarily, because otherwise you're basically eroding a lot of value because you can't sustainably operate if your revenues are just too low because the market can't absorb. Let's say if 28% of your cost is fuel and cost is 80% more expensive, and then all being equal, you now have to increase your fares at least 25%, between 20 and 25%, just to make the same margin as last year.
Which was already presumably very thin in a lot of cases, or non-existent.
And on some city pairs, you'll be able to do it depending on the competitive position. And some others, market isn't there yet. That means that it'll likely then slow down growth to some of those markets because their surplus wealth or their discretionary income is not yet at the level that is required to pay for that business. And that's why, and if the fuel drops tremendously again, then the fares come down. And then of course it can potentially develop itself again.
Yeah.
But at least the math is 28% times 80% year on year. So let's say between 20 and 25%, your fares have to come up just to make the same margin as a year ago. And everything else is getting more expensive also, right? So ticket prices will definitely have to go up, and some wealthier economies are able to absorb those. And clearly that also indicates that if you're the cost leader, like Ryanair, their future is looking bright, at least within the European realm, and some other markets also benefit. Chinese carriers also benefit from Asia to Europe traffic because they still overfly Russia airspace. So there's another advantage that they have that a lot of the other airlines don't have.
There's a very strong argument in favor of the Ryanair model, isn't there? That where they have been ferociously and aggressively focused on costs and looking at their balance sheets, their revenues, their fleet size, and their resilience and their general profitability. It does indicate quite obviously the value of managing the cost side of the business with a degree in focus and activism that many airlines are not necessarily focused on. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. Yeah. I think that,
yeah. And that takes us back to the beginning where Remco was talking about cutting costs. And how do you do that so that the person in C, as Gordon Bethune said, in From Worst to First, the stuff that makes a difference but doesn't cost you a fortune to deliver, and also looking at revised business models. But a very difficult environment out there. Remco and I thought we'd get together and talk through some of our observations, the extraordinary performance of Ryanair versus the struggling other operators in Europe, and what do we do, and how do you future-proof your airline if you're sitting in a second and third level operation outside of Europe? And certainly we'd be very interested in talking to you if you feel we can help in that particular request. So from Remco Althuis and me, both partners in Stratos 12 partnership, thank you for listening to this. We look forward to hearing and reading your comments and speaking to you if you feel we can assist in moving the puck to where it needs to be in the future. Thank you, Remco.
Thank you, Barry.
One of the effects of this whole crisis is that particularly smaller operators are finding themselves with a huge amount to deal with, a very limited window of opportunity, resilience issues, and the need for greater capacity around their thinking processes. And this is something that we've identified with our executive decision acceleration, where members of the Stratos 12 partnership, Remco Commercial and Senior Leadership, Richard Nanton, Flight Operations, Whitney Operational and Industrial Relations, Jean-Marc, MRO, and Asset Management, come in and really support small teams in airlines who are finding that they need additional thinking time, capacity, and impartial, objective, independent, and highly informed professional advice to come in and support them.
Airlines that have limited fleet units and that have parts of their network closed off. Connectivity of the country could be under tremendous pressure, meaning they may have to reinvent themselves under a short time window. So there's lots of decisions, scenarios to be looked at, new insights that they need to be gained in a very short time, and having somebody on the outside that could help them take those decisions or shape those decisions or just act as a sounding board.
We're there to support you and your airline at any time, contact us at stratos12.com. Our telephone number is on the website. Email us at partners@stratos12.com and we'll help you through this crisis.